talk to you a little bit today about a book that came out the same year that Orwell had predicted our country and our government would have become a dictatorship, a social nightmare. Only his theme was, are we amusing ourselves to death? And I want to challenge you to think about that question. Are we amusing ourselves to death? We have entered the age of entertainment in the era of the internet. Neil Postman wrote a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which he proposed the idea that an obsession with entertainment, an obsession with always having fun, could become a far more dangerous threat to us than a dangerous government, than bombs, than crime, because we would become intellectually dead. Stop and think about having written that in 1984, before the internet. The internet at that point was just barely beginning to be formed. And stop and think about what he would say today. The Washington Post calls the internet a cesspool. The man who runs the company that we use to access the internet, a company you may have heard of called Google, has worried out loud that we're not prepared for what he is giving us. Never before in the history of the world has there been more information available to us. Click of the button. The guy who makes it possible for us to click that button worries that we're not ready for it. It's like giving someone a Harley Davidson while they're still trying to take the training wheels off of their bicycle. I want to give you a couple of scary numbers. 61% of people under the age of 35 think that Facebook can be a news source. Let me say that again. 61% of people under the age of 35 think that Facebook is a news source. For me, as a journalist, a scarier number. Only 40% of Americans trust journalists. Now, I know journalists. We're wonderful people. It's unfathomable to me how that happened, but let me walk you through it. When I was young, at 6 o'clock every evening, we would sit around the TV and we would watch who? Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America. He was a journalist. Why was he trusted? In part because he followed principles. He conducted a process and led a process and committed something that we call journalism. There were 3 TV networks. There was a newspaper in every town. As time went on, journalists began to be more aggressive. And of course, there were 2 guys by the name of Woodward and Bernstein, a couple of young reporters of the Washington Post who found out about a minor break-in at a building on the Potomac River, and they began looking into it, and they eventually brought down the President of the United States. That was journalism. That inspired me. I was 13, 14 at the time, 15. I read their books. I watched the hearings. And I got into journalism. When I was 17 years old, I got my first byline. But as I got into the business, the journalists began to get a little too, journalists are navel gazers anyway. We began to think too much. And we began to worry, are we speaking to people from an ivory tower? And a lot of people who were listening to us and who were paying attention to us didn't like what we were saying, particularly if they were the politician that was getting gored by a journalist, or if they were a business person who was getting called out by a journalist. And so there was this sense that we need to back it down a little bit. We need to make it more what? Entertainment. We need to be a little less serious. And this was going on as I was entering the business in the early 1980s. Along comes cable TV, more information available to us. But one of the things that occurred as cable TV begins to emerge is you've got to fill space. You have to find a way to make money on that. And so talk shows began. And at first they were kind of harmless little talk shows about this and that. And then we began to get talk shows in which a former husband and a former wife come on stage and beat each other up. Or we learn about the paternity of a baby from is it this dude or this dude? And of course, Geraldo Rivera gets up and gets his nose broken. The problem was, everybody thought that was journalism too. We now have entered a phase where we have millions of places to go to get information. And there is this idea, and I understand the irony of standing before you, giving a TED Talk, and telling you information is bad. But I'm telling you, information is bad in the wrong hands, done the wrong way. You can click on and you can get information any way you want it. But here's the thing. Information cannot be, or journalism is not the process of building an algorithm. Google is proof that Elvis is alive, and you get 469,000 results. That's information. I'm going to take a chance here and tell you right now that almost all the information on those sites is wrong. If you Google blogs on politics, you get 261 million hits. That's about as many people about as many adults as we have in the United States of America. Now, if you think that 261 million people each is capable of providing you with insightful, accurate, helpful information about politics, then we're done here. And so those of you who believe that, it's time to take a break, have a drink, take a nap, because we're not going to get any farther. Those of you who think that maybe that doesn't work, hang with me. But that's where you're headed when you enter the cesspool that we call the internet. Here's something that I think is going to come as a surprise to you. Journalism is a thing. There's journalism and there's not journalism. It's just like there's plumbing and there's not plumbing. There's practicing law and there's not practicing law. It's the same idea. There's a thing called the Society of Professional Journalists. It's been around since 1909. They have page after page of ethical guidelines, but they have 4 basic ideas, right? Seek the truth and report it. What a concept. Stop and think about how many places do you go on the internet today where that isn't even happening. Start with Facebook. If you think Facebook is a news source, test it out. Minimize harm. When a journalist writes a story about someone who's committed a crime or is accused of a crime, harm is done to that person, I would say. But journalists commit to try to minimize harm. And we could have a whole separate TED Talk about that. Act independently. You should not be able to buy a news story. You should not be able to have someone influence you to print or not print, publish or not publish, air or not air a news story. Journalists are supposed to act independently. How many places do you go where you're not sure who's behind it? Who's buying that space? Who's paying to give you that information? Be accountable and transparent. Journalists make mistakes. They do. It comes as a surprise to a lot of you, but it happens. When they do, they need to say, oops, we made a mistake, we're sorry, we're going to try to fix it. We hope it doesn't happen very often. Be transparent. We want you to know how we go about our business. So here's what I challenge you to do when you go to a website and you're reading it. Ask yourself, are these people applying these standards? If you can't answer it for yourself, ask the source. Here's one thing that's going to happen. Let's say you send an email to the source, and you say, tell me about your standards for ethics. A lot of them are going to say, huh? This is the internet. I don't need ethics. They haven't even thought about it. But I guarantee you that the vast majority, if they have thought about it, don't have a set of standards like that. We need to demand that kind of information from the places that you get information from. Done well, at its best, journalism is a filter and an interpreter and can help you avoid the sewer of the internet. The equivalent is drinking from that place and committing intellectual suicide. So I ask you to ask yourself, ask people around you, are we amusing ourselves to death? I think that the answer, if you're serious, might surprise you and hopefully scare you just a little bit. Thank you.